Okay. I'm going to talk to you about human trafficking as it relates to the larger issue of child abuse. Um, in this issue of human trafficking, we tend to get pigeonholed and only focus on the human trafficking itself. But to help us understand what trafficking is and to better understand how it's happening in our communities, and understanding of what child abuse is and how to recognize the signs of child abuse is really important because a lot of the indicators are very similar. And human trafficking for children, is actually part of the larger picture of child abuse. It's a form of child abuse. So I'm going to go through one thing we usually don't ever do here is we don't ever give statistics because for human trafficking, statistics are very hard to come by, especially good statistics, because human trafficking is difficult to report, it's difficult to prosecute. And your main piece of evidence is the victim themselves, and they often don't identify as a victim. That is very similar for child abuse, but it's easier to prosecute child abuse because we often have advocates that help in the instance of child abuse. And we understand child abuse a lot better than we understand human trafficking. Any of us can probably be out in the community and see signs of child abuse and know that there's probably something going on. It triggers something. But we don't have those same triggers when we're looking at human trafficking, even though they can be very similar. Because we see it on an adult versus a child, or we see a child that's inappropriately dressed and we think, well, gosh, those parents, they should probably have their kid dressed better, and it could be something different. So I'm going to start giving you a bunch of statistics. This is going to be laden with statistics. There's a reason I didn't use slides. It's because I feel, for two reasons. One, I feel like we tend to rely on those visuals instead of thinking about it in our heads. Get it out of the visual. Don't allow somebody to show you pictures of what you think something should be. Get it in your head, understand it verbally and wrote within your head so it's easier to see. You have a blank slate when you go out. But also, slides, when you put it on the slide, the information can change, it gets updated, whatnot. It becomes stale, and then people tend to run back to the old pieces of information, and it just doesn't end up getting updated. So the first statistic, 60,000 children are sexually abused each year in the United States. All of my information is coming from NCMEC, which is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Also coming from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, their Office for the Administration for Children and Families. And then the National Children's Advocacy Center here in Huntsville, which also culls their information from a lot of those same sources. That's my source material for every single number that I'm giving you. And also, please excuse my voice. We had a round of the crud go through our house this past weekend. And I've been sitting in deposition prep all morning. So I've been talking all morning and I'm done. So like I said, 60,000 children are sexually abused each year in the United States. 1 in 10 children will experience sexual abuse by the age of 18. That's a huge number. 90% of children that are abused by somebody that they know and trust. Of that 90%, 60% are committed by acquaintances, teachers, neighbors, friends, coaches, pastors. 30% are by immediate or extended family. And then the other 10% of child abuse happens at the hands of strangers. So that kind of tosses the whole stranger danger. While it's important to have the stranger danger, we teach that, we emphasize that, we're missing the bus. The majority of abusers are men, but here's the statistic that shocked me and got me. Females are 4.5 times more likely to offend against their own children, their biological children. That kind of throws a wrench in the idea of who we have as abusers. Changes the picture.
That's amazing.
70% of children who are abused by a peer. So peer-to-peer abuse happens. So kids in schools, a lot of it happens. 40% of the time, I didn't put on here, but I think 40% of the time happens within, in the school setting with a peer-to-peer abuse. Children with parents who have experienced child maltreatment are almost 3 times as likely to experience it themselves. So it becomes a generational thing. Sexual abuse was the strongest predictor of human trafficking. The odds are 2.5 times greater for girls, 8.21 times greater for boys, which again throws a number because we tend to think of victims as female. While human trafficking victims are overwhelmingly female, the number of men who are being trafficked and the number of males who are being trafficked is growing. Which leads into online sexual abuse. 564,000 reports of suspected child exploitation per week. That came directly from NECMEC, which is National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. 800 reports of sextortion per week. That's the average. There are 800 reports of sextortion per week. That's just the reported. 1 in 9 youth experience online sexual exploitation. 1 in 4 minors experience online sexual grooming via long, intimate conversations in online chat rooms. Those chat rooms are built into the games that kids are playing online. And the gaming systems that kids are using, if they're not using their phones or their tablets or their TVs, or their computers, the gaming systems themselves are actually computers. Let's see, 64% of trafficking victims are recruited and or groomed by Facebook. This is the one statistic that I didn't get from NECMEC. This one came directly from the Human Trafficking Institute, which is an organization in the Washington, D.C. area that pulls information. They have actually logged and categorized every single human trafficking case that's been tried in the United States since 2000. This information was from 2020, this statistic. All of the cases that they found where they interviewed trafficking victims and traffickers, 60% or 64% of victims were groomed or recruited on Facebook. The number that were recruited online is much greater, but Facebook was the #1 recruiting and grooming tool for trafficking. Another thing to consider, this is not a statistic, but something that's happening now as we are well into the technology age and so much is happening online. Geography is no longer a deterrent for abusers. Abusers can get access to children in a matter of minutes. The grooming timeline used to be months. It's now days to hours where a kid can be groomed online to the point where they start giving out either information about themselves or sharing pictures of themselves or doing things in a video setting that compromise the safety and compromise the integrity of the child completely. What are some of the risky behaviors that we see from the groomers? What are we looking for? Typically, a groomer is going to manipulate the surrounding adults first. Groomers or abusers are typically grooming parents first to gain their trust. It's escalating abuse is what it's called. When they start with the parents, get the parents softened up, gain their trust. Parents will then, we tend to allow more access to our kids, to the people that we've built a trust relationship with. Excessive touching or blurring touching boundaries. I already building and gaining trust. Gifts and rewards. That's a big one. We've all had a neighbor, we've all seen a neighbor that, just took a liking to one of the kids in the neighborhood, was closer to their family. I'm not saying that neighbor was necessarily an abuser, but that's a trait that happens. The gifts, the abuse, the gifts and the rewards that show this kid like, hey, this person likes me, they're a good person. They wouldn't do this if they didn't. Breaking rules and pressing boundaries. Intense focus on children. This was another trait. Somebody who spends a lot of time around kids for no other apparent reason than being around them. seeking isolation and one-on-one contact. If, a room full of kids and somebody wants to pull one to the side, coaches who want to pull a kid aside to have a conversation with them should never, ever happen without the presence of another adult or a parent at the very, very least. Overly eager for children's affection. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. Taking photos and videos of an individual child, especially in like a child serving setting out in public. I've seen people do this. I ran into this in a shoe store of all places years ago up in the DC area. There was a woman walking around following this one family, videoing their children. And they were just in a shoe store. The kids were sitting in a stroller, and it turned into a big fuss, and all parties involved were thrown out of the store because the managers got tired of it. So those are some of the things the risky behaviors that we look for. So what can we do? If we see a child that looks like they have the indicators of abuse, they have, you might see marks. A lot of abuse happens outside of the public view. We don't see it happening, but we see indicators. There might be abuse. We might work in a church nursery and we're changing a diaper and we see something that just doesn't look right. The best thing you can do is be an active bystander for a kid, be an advocate for that child. Report it, run it up the chain. If the administration isn't willing to or doesn't have protocol in place for that situation, first of all, shame on them. Second of all, take it to the authorities. Note the kid's name, note the parent's name, because they all wear the little name badges. If you're out in public and you see a situation where a kid might be in a position where they are vulnerable, you can step in and be that advocate, get somebody with you, be an advocate for that child. If an abuser knows that they have been seen, they are not going to act in that moment. They will step away from the situation because the worst thing that can happen for them is that people know what they're doing. Other things that we can do, if you're a parent, a grandparent, use the actual anatomical terms for body parts. Don't use the cutesy little things. Your kids can handle it. They can handle what a penis is, what a vagina is, what a urethra is, the difference between them. Don't blast it all on them, at the age of 2 where they really can't handle it, but in doses where they are discovering who they are. And, we make a show of, these are your fingers and this is your head, and kids will touch and you tell them, and then you teach them boundaries. What are the areas of the body that are safe for people to touch? We can shake hands, we can clap hands, we can touch his face, but there are certain areas of the body that are not safe. Help your child, teach your child to set boundaries for their body. Teach your child at a very, very early age, the earliest age. Their body is theirs. It does not belong to anybody else. Mom and dad may have made it, but once that body came out of mom, that body belonged to that child. It's their body. Nobody can touch it without their permission. We build that because that instills later on, as a former prepubescent and female, I can tell you, not having those boundaries, it gets really muddy. People will want to, prepubescent, other children, as we know, will want to try to, do things that they shouldn't. And when you have good boundaries, you can say no in a much more forceful way. It's much harder to manipulate somebody who has that boundary set up. Avoid putting children in uncomfortable situations. This one always gets me in trouble, and I've literally had arguments with family members and friends on this. If a child is being tickled and they say no, they may be laughing because that is the biological, they can't control that response. That's the biological response to that sensation on those nerves. They can't control that. That doesn't mean that they like it. If they're laughing and they say no, The no, the verbal, that's the cutoff point. As a parent, I had a family member tickle my daughter, and she was laughing, and she said no, and I said, can you please stop? But she likes it. No, she doesn't. She's laughing. She can't help it. She said no. And he got upset. She got upset because he was upset. Remove her from the room, have a conversation.
How old was she at the time?
She was 3.
That's why she got upset.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. You want to avoid situations and, make children feel comfortable that not only is their body, but you need to have an open door of trust and judgment-free and shame-free so that your children can come and talk to you about questions about the changes that are going on in their body. But if God forbid something bad does happen to them and they need to come to you, they should be able to come to you without the feeling that it was their fault. Because anytime something happens to a child, to their body, it is not their fault. Hugs are another big one. Don't force your children to hug. Don't ever force physical contact. If a child doesn't want to hug you, they don't have to hug you. Trying to tell, family, friends that just because my child doesn't want to hug you doesn't mean that they don't like you. It just means that they're not in the mood to be touched. And you know what? We all have those days. So forcing affection or making a child feel like they have hurt you just because they don't want to touch you. The last thing I'm going to say is get trained. And I forwarded this email to Pat, and she can send it out to anybody interested. November 18th is National Children's Advocacy Center. They are doing their Darkness to Light Stewards of Children training. And I believe it goes from 10:30 to noon, and it's free. There's a code in the email that I shared with Pat. So if you're interested, I highly recommend taking that training. It's great for anybody who's a parent, a grandparent, the relative of the child, know children or know that children exist. It's a wonderful, wonderful training that will give you more information on signs and what to do. And then last, I'm going to leave you with 2 points. A child cannot be tasked with preventing their own abuse. They just can't. They don't have capacity for it. It's our responsibility as adults to do that, whether we are related to that child or not. We should be the ones helping to prevent that abuse. An abuser is not stopped until after the abuse happens. So every time we get these numbers about the number of child abuse, that is abuse that has already happened. There are now victims. There's a victim for every number. That's it. Any questions?
A lot of great information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. That's very, very good. Thank you. We try to educate every month a little bit, and I don't know what we're going to do next month, but we'll come up with some more training for you. We are right at 5 minutes before we end, but I'm going to go ahead. Let's see. Oh, no, I already talked about that. Our next meeting is December 3rd. Right here, and if you've signed in, you will get a notification from me saying that it's a reminder that the meeting is December 3rd, 2 o'clock. Everyone's welcome. If you know someone who wants to know more about human trafficking, have them come. We welcome new faces. The main reason we have this task force is to raise awareness, do education, and then feed any needs that we see across the state for laws that are deficient